Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series Political Conversions, I'm talking to the political historian David Klemperer about a group of individuals who embraced and then renounced communism. A number of them wrote essays about the experience in a book they published in 1949 called The God That Failed. They compared their experience to religious conversion and the loss of faith. Are they to be believed? Last time we talked about a series of cases of individuals who became fascists. Today we're going to talk about what is in many ways the parallel story, and a lot of it is rooted in the same decade, the 1930s. Individuals who became communists. A difference in this case, individuals who became communists, converted, and then lost the faith. That's what today's story is about. But we can start with someone who connects these two stories very directly because, David, you mentioned him in the last episode when we were talking about Oswald Mosley, a man called John Strachey, who was in many ways Mosley's sidekick and who followed him on that journey through the 1920s in the Labour Party, trying to get the Labour Party to adopt Mosleyite ideas and reforms, in frustration, leaving the party, joining the new party, leaving the new party. But here's where the stories diverge. At that point, Mosley and Strachey take the two opposite paths. Strachey became a communist. So just tell us a little bit more about who he was. But really what we want to understand is how to explain that very, very different outcome from what had looked to that point like a very similar journey.
John Strachey is, in many ways, a similar man to Mosley. He's a little bit younger, but like Mosley, he's someone from an aristocratic conservative family who, in the early 1920s, joins the Labour Party and becomes convinced of the need for socialist politics. Compared to Mosley, Strachey's somewhat of a bit more of an intellectual figure. He initially isn't a parliamentarian, and he's someone who's quite interested in Marxism. So there's a more sort of theoretical dimension to his political thinking. But in the 1920s, he plays a key role in helping Mosley develop his proposals. When Mosley is a minister, Strachey, at this point, who is an MP, becomes his parliamentary private secretary. And he leaves the Labour Party with Mosley and helps him found the new party. But the break comes early in the short life of the new party, when Strachey becomes convinced that Mosley is on the road to fascism. And there's a specific moment that Strachey later points to, which is after the new party has contested its first by-election and the crowd of Labour supporters has heckled Mosley, and Mosley has said to the people he's with, "Those are the crowd who've stopped us doing anything since the war." Strachey said at that point that he knew that Mosley was going to become a fascist, because the moment that Mosley saw the trade unions and the organised working class as his enemy, at that point he was no longer a man of the left and was going to move inexorably towards fascism. And for Strachey, who had been close to Mosley for so long, this is a very difficult break. But Strachey has a kind of Marxist politics that sees the working class as absolutely central. And so he'd been willing to go on with some of the new party's controversial ideas about having, say, a paramilitary units, as long as those were going to be used on the side of the working class. But when he sees the new party as moving against the working class, he breaks with it. And he becomes convinced, like Mosley, but from the other side, that politics is going to be a clash between communists and fascists. He sees the Ramsay MacDonald government as proof that social democracy, the creed he had committed himself to in the 1920s, was bankrupt and did not have the solutions. That capitalism was inevitably falling apart, and that capitalism would try to defend itself in the most brutal and violent means through fascism. And this left Strachey with one choice, which was something he quite openly said that he hadn't wanted to do, which is to support communism. And he writes a book in 1932, The Coming Struggle for Power, in which he lays all this out and says very explicitly, because I want to defend human civilization and human values, I see no alternative to supporting the communists against the fascists in the struggle that is to come. Interestingly, he doesn't join the Communist Party because the communists don't want him to. They want him to be outside the Communist Party as a propagandist and fellow traveller. But over the course of the 1930s, he is possibly the most important communist intellectual in Britain in terms of shaping how communism is understood and perceived, and being someone who's constantly defending communist positions in the public sphere.
So there is a point of connection here. The thing that they agreed on in 1931 is that the centre was inevitably going to be squeezed, the conventional parties were going to be squeezed, and the coming struggle was going to boil down to a choice between communism and fascism. What's interesting is when it looked like that choice, they could agree before the choice was forced, but when the choice was forced, they were on opposite sides.
And initially, they both wanted to avoid that choice. For both Strachey and Mosley, Mosley's proposals in 1930 were the way of preventing that choice, of keeping things together. But it's when Mosley is doing badly in the new party that they both become convinced that there is going to be this final showdown and that they have to pick a side.
So some of this is clearly a story of intellectual formation and the role that ideas play in human beings' lives. Of these two men, one was already open to Marxism and one wasn't. It's also a story of contingency. So another parallel between both their stories is that their marriages broke down. They both embarked on affairs. In Mosley's case, it was with Diana Mitford. She was not a communist. In the case of Strachey, it was with a woman called Celia Simpson, and she was a communist. And he ended up marrying her. And that must have played a part in this story too. In a sense, some of it at least feels quite contingent on human personal relationships. As they part, they also enter on new personal relationships which cement the new identity and may even have had some part in shaping the new identity.
That's absolutely right. I think so much of their politics is shaped by the people around them and who they're engaging with. And we know that Strachey and Celia Simpson had been having a very kind of intellectual relationship in the run-up to his decision to leave his wife and to be with her. But the decision to become a communist is incredibly difficult for Strachey. Breaking with Mosley is hard, and he essentially has a mental breakdown at the start of this period and goes to a lot of psychoanalysis and gets very interested in Freud at the same time as he is turning towards communism as, in his view, the only solution. And I think it is interesting with Strachey how much this was a kind of conclusion he hadn't wanted to have to come to. He had been very interested in Marxism as a philosophy and as a sort of economic doctrine in the 1920s, and he'd been paying a lot more attention to the Communist Party than most Labour intellectuals, but he hadn't wanted to join. And it was only after the break with Mosley, which I think was very personally difficult, but I think he also felt appalled by the fascism that he'd helped contribute to, pushes him towards this sort of extreme position.
This is a story of a man who embraces communism at the start of the 1930s, and by the end of that decade has abandoned it. And it's a pattern that we're going to see across a range of intellectuals. This is, again, a story of intellectuals that we're going to talk about here, some British, some not, including American, European intellectuals. The 1930s were a decade where actually it's quite a common story to see certain intellectuals who had resisted communism in the 1920s come to embrace it. And clearly the key event here is the Great Depression and the fallout of the Great Depression, not just the economic consequences, but the political consequences, because they include the rise of Hitler's version of fascism. Through the 1930s and a series of events in the 1930s, in the second half of that decade, that changed the way that intellectuals who had come into communism at the start came to view it. And we'll talk about these events. They include the Spanish Civil War. They include the Moscow show trials. But perhaps most significantly of all, and this seems to be the case with Strachey, the thing that he could not swallow, and many others could not swallow, was the Nazi-Soviet pact. The irony of this story is it begins with what looks like a world in which a fundamental existential choice is going to be forced on everyone, including all intellectuals, which is you're going to have to say, in the end, are you with the communists or are you with the fascists? This is the irreconcilable choice of our times. In the summer of 1939, Molotov and Ribbentrop signed a pact between the two irreconcilable existential forces at work during the 1930s. And for Strachey, as for others, it destroyed his faith.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And over the course of the 1930s, anti-fascism is so central to communism and to the appeal of communism. And this is partly the result of the success of fascism itself, But it's also about how the communists react to the rise of fascism. Throughout the 1920s, the communists around Europe and in America as well had been acting in a very sectarian fashion. The line of the Communist International was that all the other left-wing parties were traitors or even fascist themselves. There was this idea that socialist or social democratic parties were social fascists. They were no different from Hitler and Mussolini. Once fascism has won in Germany, and the socialist movement in Germany has been crushed, once the communist movement in Germany has effectively been crushed, the Communist International realizes the error of this doctrine and adopts a new strategy, the strategy of the Popular Front, calling for unity of all democratic and left-wing forces, playing down what is distinctively communist about their own parties, and trying to make anti-fascism the center of their politics. And this means that communism suddenly becomes a lot more appealing to a load of intellectuals. It no longer seems like this foreign sectarian creed. It seems like a democratic movement of working people who are standing up against what seems like this ultimate evil. And Strachey in Britain is a key part of that movement, and he's a leading Popular Front intellectual. He's very involved with the Left Book Club, which was a Popular Front project bringing together communists, socialists, even liberals to promote these ideas of anti-fascism, democracy, and socialism. And Strachey is able to sort of overlook a huge amount about the regime that he's defending, the politics that he's defending, when there is that broader anti-fascist purpose. But when Hitler and Stalin come to an agreement, and when, once the war begins, the Communist Party in Britain, its line switches, having throughout the 1930s been the most aggressively anti-Hitler party, calling for the hardest line against Germany, opposing appeasement. When the war breaks out, in the British Communist Party, those old habits kick in. The leader, Harry Pollitt, puts out a statement supporting the war effort against Germany. But then the order comes from Moscow that in line with the new pact, this isn't to be the case. And the Communist Party's line changes very quickly, and they start to say that they oppose Britain's involvement in the Second World War. And that, for Strachey, is the final straw. He had been very upset by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, but he had sort of hoped to kind of justify and rationalize it, hoped that it wasn't a big deal. But it's when the Communist Party changes its line that he realizes that, in his view, what he stands for has been betrayed and that he was wrong to put his faith in the communists.
And when that happens, so the choice is no longer fascist or communist, he does the thing that seemed impossible at the start of the 1930s, which is he returns to what you might call mainstream centrist social democracy. And of course, among other things, the war makes this possible, because if you are going to fight fascism as a British patriot, which is what he then becomes in that context, you will be fighting fascism in the name of a government which contains both Labour and Conservative politicians of the mainstream. So in his case, we're going to talk about other examples in a moment, but in his case, he follows Mosley to 1931, then he breaks, and he becomes a communist, or at least a communist fellow traveller, and he has a breakdown, and he has a new marriage. Through the 1930s, he becomes a kind of propagandist for the Popular Front. When it all falls apart, does he return back to his roots, or do you think it's something new? In a sense, is he back to where he started, say, in the mid-1920s, which is this has to happen within the institutions of the Labour Party, it has to happen within the institutions of parliamentary democracy, new ideas will be needed, we need new ways of thinking about the challenges of a post-war world, having won the war. But is it a story that returns to its beginning, do you think? Or should we see this as a series of conversions or transformations?
I don't think it quite returns for the start. Certainly he returns to the Labour Party and he returns to social democracy, and he returns to his initial project of trying to develop a new economic project for social democracy. And this is some of what he does during the war and indeed afterwards. But I think we can say that his politics is forever shaped by the experience of having been through communism. And the result is that he is very hostile to communism. And a lot of what he is thinking about in the post-war period is not just how to make social democracy work, but how to make it work partly so as to prevent communism from being an appealing alternative. So he becomes a social democrat, as he was before, and he even remains a Marxist of a kind, but it is a Marxist who is very concerned about communism and about the threat posed by communism to the values that he ultimately decides that he cares about.
So could you call him, by the end, a Cold Warrior?
I think you could, yes.
So that story in microcosm is a version of a series of stories of a range of different thinkers, writers, and intellectuals over this period. And one set of those stories are told in a single book. And this book, in a way, is what we're going to now talk about, published in 1949. It's called The God That Failed. It was edited by the Labour politician Richard Crossman, deputy editor, I think, at that time of the New Statesman. He himself had never been a communist. In his introduction to this book, he said one of the reasons that he had never been a communist is his cussed nonconformist background. He could never quite make the leap in the way that these other people who might be more prone to all or nothing ideas of the world were able to do. He gathered together 6 writers who wanted to tell the story, in his words, of what it meant not to be an anti-communist, because Crossman was an anti-communist, as were many people in the Attlee government, I think almost all people in the Attlee government after 1945. He wanted to know the story of the ex-communists, because he felt they knew things that the anti-communists didn't know, including they knew what it was like to acquire and then lose that faith. And in that book, and I'm not sure if this is true of the Strachey story, but it's certainly true of the way that these writers, and they include people like Arthur Koestler, Stephen Spender, and others, tell their story. They do frame it in the language of faith. It's called The God That Failed. And communism is treated as a kind of surrogate religion, and a religion of a particular kind. I actually think it's a caricature of religion. And the religion that they seem to have in mind, many of them, is Catholicism, which they treat actually not as a religion. They treat it more like a cult. But it's the idea that what happens when you acquire the faith is you are initiated in a kind of brotherhood in which your cares and concerns are taken away because you know what to think about everything. And when you lose the faith, it is the equivalent to losing religious faith, and it scars you in similar ways. So there are lots of interesting things about this book. It's an interesting book. It's a frustrating book. It's quite a weird book. But it is absolutely a story of conversion and loss of faith. It is treating this experience as pseudo-religious, which I think you couldn't do of the Mosley case. I don't think there's a way of telling the Mosley story as a pseudo-religious journey of awakening and then loss of faith. But these people do. So I want to talk about some of their individual stories, but what do you think of that framing? Because we're calling this series Political Conversions, but conversions do not have to be religious experiences. But it's assumed here that something about communism, in the way maybe it's only in the case of intellectuals, it grabs people, and then in the end, they lose their faith. Something about it is equivalent to religion.
I think the key thing that means that there is a kind of comparison to be drawn with religion is that faith in communism requires a kind of outsourcing of judgment. And I think that's one of the key things that these people write about. They decide to embrace this movement. And that doesn't just mean this is what they've decided that they're going to think, but they've decided to allow another movement in some ways to tell them what to think. And that is, I think, what a lot of these stories are about, is about these people struggling with trying to evaluate whether they've made the right choice in allowing the communist parties in their different countries to tell them what and how to think. And I think that is what makes it for them something equivalent to a religious experience, because it's not just about thinking that communism is good. It's about whether they can accept all the different things that come with it and whether they can subsume their own identities into this wider movement. I think that's such a difference with the Mosley stories, that Mosley's story is almost about his own belief in himself, whereas what these people did when they joined the Communist Party is they made a conscious decision to subsume themselves into something bigger and more important. And what they describe over the course of these essays is why and how they eventually broke out of that, and what made them unable to accept what it was they were being told, what it was they were being asked to think.
If I were a Catholic, which I'm not, but if I were a Catholic, I think I would think that these intellectuals have a somewhat parodic view of the religion that they're comparing their own experience to. So yes, it is something bigger and more significant than themselves, and that's certainly true of the religious experience. But the outsourcing of judgment, Crossman, in his introduction, more or less draws a parallel between Stalin and the Pope. And the thing that is always said of Catholics, including of Catholics in Britain, is in the end they've outsourced their judgment to the Pope. But I think many of them would say they have not done that, because this is not communism. Catholicism is religion which is different, and religion has a richer aspect to it than the stories that are being told in this book, which very much are of individuals who don't simply outsource their judgment, but then over the course of the decade, the key decade, the 1930s, come to realize that they've outsourced their judgment to people whom they absolutely cannot trust, and yet still persuade themselves that it has to be done, that there is no choice because the stakes are existential in political terms. These are not people who have decided that there is a domain in which someone else's judgment is going to take priority over theirs, but they are still going to live a meaningful life. They lose faith, and yet they retain their faith. And that's the story that they tell. They can see that they are allowing decisions to be taken for them by people whom they should not allow decisions to be taken for them by. And yet they continue until each of them reaches a point where they can't continue. And again, what's interesting about it is for each of them, in the language of the book, there's a kind of Kronstadt moment. And you can say in a moment what that means. But there is a moment of truth where something that's become more and more strained finally snaps. And it feels to me like to say, so it's like the Catholic experience, doesn't just misrepresent the Catholic experience, it misrepresents the communist experience too, because the thing that they are describing actually doesn't really have a parallel in that sense.
I think that's right. And I think that Crossman's introduction, where he does try and make this explicit comparison between communism and what he calls popery, I think is somewhat unfair. I think what is interesting is the way in which many of the authors of the book understand their change in religious terms, but not in a way that puts them against religion. Quite a few of these essays end with a suggestion that the antidote to communism is some kind of acceptance of Christian values and Christian civilization. Ignazio Saloni's essay ends in this way, for instance, as does André Gide's. So certainly I don't think it is a book that is making an anti-religious argument. I think what's more interesting is the way in which they're framing communism as a kind of warped religion. It's clearly something they see as playing on these religious needs or instincts, but not something that should be understood as a straightforward comparator to religion, which they're often quite sympathetic to in the text.
Which is why Crossman's introduction is actually misleading, the implication that his cussed nonconformism allows him to see that the comparison here is communism as Catholicism, whereas, as you say, the real comparison in the book is false and true religion. And communism, they all come to the conclusion in their different ways, is a false religion. So as with Strachey, there are two sides to the story that has to be told, and each of them tells it. And actually, someone like Koestler spends far more time talking about what brought him into communism than in the end what caused him to leave. But we need to know first, in each case, how they were seduced or how they came to hold the faith, and then how they came to lose it. And it does seem to turn, in each case, on that choice, that sense that emerged at the beginning of the 1930s, that the world was boiling down to something much more existential than had appeared to be the case in the 1920s, where there was a range of options to be explored. Koestler says that he arrived in Germany, I think, in 1932, and almost the first thing he read was a book which was basically called Fascism or Communism. There is no third option. And it's the absence of the third option which is a big part of what drives them in each case. So that is something which is analogous to the other stories that we've been talking about.
I think with some of them, yes. But I think what's interesting is that across the 6 essays, we actually see something of almost the 3 different things that drew people to communism over the course of the interwar period. So I think if we're looking at the converts to communism, we can identify kind of 3 different waves. The first wave is the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, when people see the possibilities for communist revolution across Europe and see this as a sort of exciting thing. Often these are people who are already active within the socialist movement who turn to communism as those socialists who seem to have actually accomplished something. And Ignazio Saloni's essay would be an example of this. So he is already a socialist in 1917, and when the Italian Communist Party forms in 1921, he does his best to bring the youth wing of the Socialist Party into the Communist Party with him. Then there's a second wave in the 1920s, and these are the people who turn to communism because it is the alternative to a civilization that they have come to see as in some ways broken. So Louis Fisher, in his contribution, describes traveling in Europe, being disgusted with what he sees of European civilization, and seeing the Bolsheviks and Soviet Russia as this healthy alternative that seems to be heading in the right direction. Richard Wright's contribution is similar in this sense. His story is very distinct because of the element of race, and he is describing his experience of racism in America, and the Communist Party is the movement that seemed open to someone like him and willing to engage with him. And then there is this third wave in the early 1930s, which is precisely this moment when people who weren't initially attracted by communism believe themselves to be facing a fundamental choice between communism and fascism and consider communism to be the superior alternative. And so this is the case of Koestler, who looks at Weimar Germany, sees liberal newspapers failing to properly stand up for their principles, increasingly pandering to fascist ideas, sees the weakness of the Social Democratic Party, and thinks only the Communist Party is going to be able to win out against fascism in the clash that is to come.
In the Italian case, of course, the choice between fascism and communism comes much earlier. But I think you're right. Actually, in some ways, the interesting ones are the two American examples, Wright and Fisher, because clearly a big part of that is a sense of the decadence of Europe, European imperialism, the ideas of empire. It's the anti-imperialism of the communists. It's the ways in which the communists behaved, Lenin, Trotsky, at the end of the First World War, exposing the hypocrisy of the great imperial powers, revealing all of their secret treaties. Communism, in that sense, seemed to stand for a certain kind of truth-telling about imperial power, which seems to particularly have struck these two Americans. And of course, as you say, in one case, this is then shaped by experiences of racism.
And I think what's so interesting about Louis Fisher's contribution is that when he talks about his conversion to being a fellow traveler of the communist movement, what he says that he found appealing about the Soviet Union isn't the material reality, but more the spirit that he found there amongst the Communist Party. So he acknowledges that it was a dictatorship, that there wasn't much material success as of yet. It was the era of Lenin's new economic policy, when in some ways there had been a retreat towards the market. But he was impressed by the attitude of the Communist Party members themselves, who seemed so committed to this new way of doing things, to internationalism, to solidarity, and that's what attracts him to communism, and means that he, over the subsequent decades, becomes this interpreter of communism, this journalist who's in Moscow and writing for an American audience about the Soviet Union in generally very positive terms. And when he describes his gradual disillusionment, so much of it isn't necessarily about the horrors, but it's about the decline in that kind of spirit that he sees amongst communist activists as they become increasingly cowed and afraid, as there's this personality cult around Stalin, as there's an increasing celebration of Russian nationalism. These are things that go against exactly what it was that he'd liked about communism in the first place and make it then harder for him to overlook what we might see as the much more serious crimes.
One of the things that these stories do seem to have in common, as you've just suggested there, is that they tell of a disillusionment that is both gradual and sudden. To use that cliche about bankruptcy, it happens both gradually and suddenly, in the sense there is a steady and corrosive loss of faith or loss of confidence, partly because of a growing awareness of a movement that had initially appealed as a truth-telling movement being a vehicle of many different kinds of hypocrisy and lying, but that there's also a point of no return for many of them, past which they can no longer give this movement the benefit of the doubt. So many of them describe initial moments of disillusion, but they can accommodate them. This is part of a movement that does have to make compromises and sacrifices. No one said it was going to be easy. They are all intellectuals, and various of them talk about a kind of almost intellectual lack of confidence in confronting some of the horrors that they see because they're just intellectuals. This is a working movement of working people, and maybe they've over-intellectualized it. Maybe, they've overthought it, whereas what they should be doing is remembering the ultimate goal towards which they're all working. And yet, this theme that runs through the book is of the Kronstadt moment. So let's just say what the Kronstadt moment means. But then I want to ask you about various iterations of that in the 1930s.
So the idea of the Kronstadt moment comes from an anarchist originally, Alexander Berkman, who wrote that he'd been willing initially to support the Bolsheviks, despite in some ways it going against his principles. But it was only after the suppression of the Kronstadt mutiny in 1921, a moment when it was clear that the Communist Party was doing something violent and brutal and against working class socialists, or at least people who presented themselves as working class socialists, that he suddenly could no longer endorse what he was seeing. And it's that idea of something which for you crosses a line and means you can no longer support this movement.
So for these writers, Kronstadt is not that moment. So it's a term of art. They didn't lose their faith in 1921. What's interesting about some of these stories is the central role that the Spanish Civil War plays. The Popular Front and the Spanish Civil War. So you've mentioned it in relation to Strachey, which is that, in a way, for him, the happiest time to be a communist is to be a spokesman for the idea of the Popular Front, the idea that this is anti-fascism, which is an ecumenical movement of all right-thinking people who see the choices that we face, but it includes social democrats and others. For some of these writers in the early 1930s, there is a gradual loss of belief in the movement to which they have subscribed. But then the Spanish Civil War comes as a moment of renewal, because at the start, it looks like this is the Popular Front in action, that the communists are part of a wider movement, and it is a fight, a literal fight against fascism, against Francoism, which is a form of fascism, within which the communists will be playing a part along with others. So in a way, to start with, the Spanish Civil War looks like it is the thing that's going to allow people to keep the faith. But then over the course of those 3 years, not only is the war lost, but the behavior of the communists, of the Stalinists within the popular resistance to Francoism is the thing that causes, for some of them at least, it to be no longer tolerable to remain in the movement. So for some of them, the Spanish Civil War is that event, not for all of them, but for some of them. And it feels like it's a microcosm of that larger story that you told in relation to Strachey, which is you embrace the Popular Front because the fight against fascism is everything. And at the end of the decade, you see the Nazi-Soviet pact. That story is played out between 36 and 39 in the Spanish case itself.
Yes, and it's because of this contrast between the ideal and the reality of the Popular Front. Spain is supposed to be this example of left-wing unity against the fascists, but when these people spend time in Spain and encounter the activities of the communists there, they find that that unity is a lie, and that the communists are using that unity to their own ends. And if something within the Popular Front threatens the communists, then it is dealt with brutally and ruthlessly. And this is the thing that so many of them cease to be able to take, because they see behind the curtain of the Popular Front to the sectarian reality, and they're reminded of everything they maybe initially didn't like about communism. And they see people who they see as on their side. They see people fighting for the international brigades, people who are members of working class left-wing parties in Spain. They see these people effectively persecuted by the communists. And suddenly, communist violence is no longer against faceless civilians in Russia or against people they can justify violence against because they're pro-fascist or class enemies or capitalists. It's against people they see as their comrades in the struggle against fascism. And that's a turning point for so many of them.
So that's one of the things that Koestler talks about in his account. He was in Spain, and indeed, for a while, he thought he was going to be executed when he was taken prisoner. And it's part of the frustration of their accounts, because I find myself wanting to say to them, well, what did you think was going to happen? That they suddenly, Koestler comes to an awareness that these are actual human beings who are suffering as a consequence of this doctrine. The doctrine justifies itself in abstract language, in terms of long time horizons, in terms of a promised future in which all human beings will be better off. But the means that justify the ends, the means are the suffering of real flesh and blood human beings. And where they say it's like a kind of religion, I want to say to them, it's more like a cult, in the sense that, were you really at a point where you couldn't see or understand that human suffering is human suffering, that statistics mean actual people. Maybe it's easy with hindsight to say this, but I find myself wanting to channel George Orwell would be the obvious person who did frequently say to all of them to their faces, what the hell did you think it was going to be? Of course, when suffering happens, it is human beings who suffer. And yet they write about it as though it took a moment of revelation for them to see it.
And for some of them, they are able to accept that kind of instrumentalism in theory, and it's then when they're confronted with it in practice that they can't accept it. For others, I think they don't lose, initially at least, they don't lose faith in the idea of using people as means to an end. It's only when they start doubting that it's actually serving the end that they have a problem with it. So Strachey, for instance, it's only when he ceases to believe that the Soviet state is legitimately anti-fascist that he loses faith. And then for some others, I think it's not even about means versus ends. It's about intellectual honesty. I thought Saloni's account is very compelling, where he talks about the thing that drove him out was being asked to support a statement he hadn't read. And in this case, it was a statement denouncing another faction of the Communist Party, denouncing Trotsky for various crimes. And he was asked to give his assent to it. And he says, well, I can't do that until I've read it. And they refuse to let him read it. And he knows at that point that he can't continue to be part of this movement.
Yeah, I was struck by that too, because his objection is not to the ludicrousness of the charges against the various people who are accused of being Trotskyite. It's a classic intellectual anxiety, in a sense, a classic anxiety of an intellectual, which is, it's almost a form of vanity. I will potentially sign up to any old nonsense, but I've got to have exercised my own personal judgment over it first, and then I'll sign up to it. Rather than the substance, it was the method being we're going to take your signature for granted. It's also true in Fisher's case that notoriously, I think, he was reporting on the Soviet Union back to Americans, and during the Ukraine famine, he did not see what you might think anyone would have noticed, which was the scale of the suffering. He was still willing to, I think it's fair to say, explain it away. It was only later on, and particularly with things like the show trials. And the show trials were one of the other key factors for some of them. So the book is published in 1949. George Orwell's 1984 has come out by this point in 1948. So one or two of them are able to reference to this new set of ideas called doublespeak. But the example that they give is the Moscow show trials. And again, for some of them, it's as though there was a level of nonsense that they were willing to swallow, and then there was a point beyond which they couldn't go. And reading about it, it is, I don't know what the word for it is, it's kind of frustrating. I want to shout at them, why this far? And then suddenly the penny drops. Because, with hindsight, the show trials look not revelatory, but emblematic of something.
I think what's also interesting as well is how often they don't really want to break with communism. They want to just disagree on a bit, but you can't just disagree on a bit. That's what they've signed up to. They've signed up to something that doesn't let you pick and choose. You have to accept all of it or none of it. And so they find themselves in this situation where they try to accept most of it and aren't able to do so. And so Koestler, for instance, gives an account of his final speech as a communist, where he says to the meeting in Paris, and it's a speech that for the most part agrees with the line of the Communist Party, but he includes 3 phrases that he knows that the communists won't like, essentially about how no one party has a total monopoly on truth. And the communists in the room can tell exactly what he's doing, and they react very negatively to this speech. And he's said it like that deliberately. And when he writes his letter of resignation, he says, I still consider myself a friend of the Soviet Union, but it isn't enough. And it's that refusal to accept everything that means they're forced to accept none. And then once that break has happened, only then are they able to radically move away from some of the things they previously accepted.
Is it only with hindsight that it looks a little odd that so many of them are still framing this in the language of communism, a set of ideas that are connected to Marxism, and yet the thing that they are describing is Stalinism, not communism. And Stalinism by the 1930s was a cult. It was a personality cult. And the means that they were swallowing for the sake of the end were the means of a personality cult. The reason that it was so imbued with what some of them have come to call doublespeak is because this was not communism in that sense. This was Stalinism. And yet there's very little talk in this book of this being Stalinism. It's as though the thing that they joined, the thing that they signed up to was communism. That's the thing they value. That's the thing that they regret the loss of. That's the thing that they're still nostalgic for. Even when they've left the faith, they still want to burnish it.
I think that speaks to the early Cold War moment that this book is published in 1949, and it speaks to a time when communism and Stalinism were, for most of the world, synonymous, because communism was embodied in a particular state which had a particular leader, and Stalin was still the leader of the Soviet Union and had been for 2 decades at this point. So I can see why that's the case. But I think, it does speak to this as a kind of Cold War text, and I think it's interesting to think about the politics of this book, which I think there's a kind of dual aspect to. So on the one hand, this is a book edited by someone who is of the left. Richard Crossman is a Labour MP, and not just a Labour MP, he is a left-wing Labour MP. And many of the writers within it would still profess themselves to be on the left and to be socialists. And so in that sense, it is a anti-communist book, but it is a book from a kind of left-wing political perspective. Many of them end their essays by saying that to defeat communism, you need a more authentic socialism. You need to preserve the socialist ideal. You need to support the poor people in the world who might otherwise be tempted to support the communists. But at the same time, I think throughout the book, you can see a more general kind of Cold War ideology bleeding through in some of the descriptions of what is bad about communism. There is a tendency to reduce it to it being Russian. Various points, they talk to the sort of Asiatic despotism of the communist state, or to a particular Russian chauvinist mentality that they see. So it becomes this sort of civilizational critique rather than just a political one. You also see this in the way Christian civilization is held up as an alternative to communism. And I think there is a kind of dual aspect to this text, because it is on the one hand a anti-communist text, and on the other hand it is a left-wing text. And the material history of this speaks to this as well. It was edited by Richard Crossman, but it was promoted and distributed by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an intellectual organization that it later transpired was funded by the CIA. So it's these sort of left liberal, social democratic intellectuals making these arguments against communism, but in doing so, they are also part of this broader Cold War, and the nature of the text speaks to that.
One of the things I was really struck by, and this I think also touches on the fact that this is a book that's doing very different things at the same time. The introduction is quite English. As I say, he proudly calls himself nonconformist, and that's why he never fell for it. It is clearly the work of an active politician who wants, in a way, to use this set of stories to allow people to return to something more sensible. In a sense, it's almost like tales of people who have gone out to exotic places, lived a slightly illusory existence, and have returned to their senses. And yet the other figure who recurs in this book is Gandhi. So Gandhi actually comes up a surprising amount as offering the alternative model. And it's the alternative model because Gandhi embodies, for at least a couple of the contributors here, the idea that there is never a justification of the means by the ends, that the ends are the means. And Gandhi, in his own writing, was quite explicit about that. He said what's gone wrong with Western politics is this disconnect between the means and the end. But it is Gandhi essentially as a kind of mystical political figure. It's not a return. I don't think many people in centrist social democratic politics would think that the model to replace this infatuation with communism and Stalinism is a kind of Gandhian religious politics. But for at least a couple of the contributors, that's where they end up. So in a way, it does come back to that question of, is this or is this not a surrogate religion? I mean, one of the things, and it relates to what we were talking about in relation to Mosley, is how typical or atypical these stories are. So they may be atypical because this is the story of intellectuals, and intellectuals are not normal people, they're intellectuals. And then within the broader set of intellectuals, there is this subset of intellectuals who seem to have had a particular propensity for this kind of politics, A lot of them write about their nostalgia and regret for what they've lost. And if you try to pin down what it is that they've lost, it's not just certainty. It's not just the outsourcing of opinion. They're intellectuals. They don't want to outsource opinion. It's solidarity. It's a feeling that they're not in the ivory tower anymore. They're in the world. They're with real flesh and blood people, which is why it's so odd that they have to see these people suffer to notice that human suffering is human suffering. And the thing that they feel like they've lost is that they've come out of their ivory towers and they've made real human connections. But it's as though for a while they thought the only way people like them can make real human connections is in a movement like this one. And then some of them still seem to be looking for some kind of equivalent movement to allow them to make the real human connection. So I'm not sure. Do you think these people are atypical? Do you think that actually, so we're talking about political conversions and this story of people who move in and out of communism. Do you think there's something actually quite unusual about this subset of individuals?
I wouldn't say they're unusual necessarily. I think the stories they tell about how they go into communism and how coming out is this kind of gradual process where there's things that make them increasingly uncomfortable and then there's something that finally they can't accept, does speak to the broader ways in which people came to be disillusioned with communism and people left communism. I think what is maybe distinctive is, as you say, the relationship here to religion and the way they're trying to engage with this in religious terms. And I think this is, again, something that speaks specifically to this period where there was this idea that communism was a challenge to religion that was in some ways like a religion, but a perverted form of religion. And I think you can see this in The God That Failed. I think another book that's interesting to compare The God That Failed to in this light is Witness by Whittaker Chambers, who was an American communist spy who left the communist movement very dramatically and came into public attention when he testified against other communists to Congress. And he wrote a book that was, I would say, much more Manichaean in its presentation of things than The God That Failed, where he essentially argues that there are two options. There is Christianity and God, and there is communism. And communism in this sense is painted at once like a religion, but on the other hand, as the anti-religion, as rationalism taken to an extreme. And interestingly, John Strachey, with whom we started the episode, wrote very interestingly about these books, and he argued that there was this anti-communist literature that he was in many ways very sympathetic to, where people wrote about why they ceased to be communists. But he was concerned that this literature was ultimately arguing against reason and arguing against rationalism and arguing for a more traditional kind of faith. And as a anti-communist who was also a progressive social democrat who still saw his thought as influenced by Marxism, he was concerned by this direction that he saw anti-communist literature as taking in the 50s. And I think in The God That Failed, we can see the beginning of that kind of tendency that then comes out in a more extreme way as the Cold War develops.
Do you think these stories are also atypical in the sense that they are not standard stories of people having dramatic changes of mind about politics because the circumstances of the 1930s were so, relatively speaking, unusual? Not just that the stakes were so high, but that decade, it's an extraordinary decade in the way that the arc of it does seem to fit this kind of narrative. There are conditions at the start of that decade that are really ripe for people to move into this worldview. And through the decade, there are these moments where people are confronted with something that makes it almost impossible to stay. The Nazi-Soviet pact is quite hard to reconstruct now just how shocking it was, how truly shocking for many people it was, and how it made a mockery of everything. So human beings in different contexts do often have a political faith or a political creed which they abandon when they suddenly realize it just doesn't work, it's not fit for purpose. But this particular version of that story, the stakes are so high, but also that pseudo-religious language. Do you think actually it's not that it so much fits the story of communism as that what it is explained by are the circumstances of the 1930s?
I think I disagree. I think this is distinctive to communism because I think what is very specific about these stories is not just the politics of the 1930s, but the nature of what they were part of. And I think communism was very distinctive from pretty much every other political movement of its time, just in terms of how all-encompassing it was. If you were a member of the Socialist Party, that could take up a lot of your time, that could be important to your identity, but it didn't have the same hold on you. It wasn't as central to your entire existence as being a communist was. There's a quote in a Paul Nizan novel where someone explains why he joined the Communist Party and not the Socialist Party. And he said, well, the Socialists gave me an option of people to do politics with. I wanted people to live with. And that was the communist movement. And I think you can see this in how central communism remains to all of these people after they cease to be communists. It is the experience that defines their life, because nothing they've done since has been as all-encompassing, as intense as being part of this communist movement was. So I think it is a very specific story about communism. You could say it's about Stalinism, perhaps, and about the nature of that kind of communism in that period. But I think that the movements they were part of were different from other political movements, and that is what really shapes the nature of their conversions.
And that quote is a good example of the thing that they all really do convey they feel the loss of. And the thing that they feel the loss of is not political. The thing that they feel the loss of is some kind of human connection that they feel they don't get in other ways. I mean, Koestler conveys that quite strongly, I think. That sense, even though he comes to view it as fraudulent, and actually he describes the characters with whom he was interacting as people who were not leading lives truthfully with whom he could have truthful relationships. But something captured him and was lost, and he doesn't believe he's going to get it any other way.
I think that's right. And I think that for so many people, they miss communism even as they lament its evils.
But the Spanish Civil War is another example of that. There's a kind of extra level then of nostalgia for the thing that was lost. The dream at the start of the Spanish Civil War, that this would be the lived experience of that kind of brotherhood, and it is a brotherhood. Women appear in this story as ciphers in many ways. All of the contributors to this book, The God That Failed, are men. We've been talking about men. This is seems like quite a male experience. One last question, and this is going to lead on to our next conversation about another set of journeys into the Cold War world. So we've talked about some of these people needing to replace that faith, that creed they had, with another one. And for some of them, it is replacing false religion with what they come to see as true religion. It is also true that by the time we enter the Cold War, there are other creeds available, including a kind of faith in liberal freedom and democracy. For these writers in The God That Failed, do you think in 1949 it was a stage on a journey to another kind of faith for some of them? A faith in the anti-communist position, that is, a faith in the things for which anti-communists in the United States particularly stood?
I think for these writers, it isn't really. And I think that The God That Failed is a book that is often somewhat mischaracterized with reference to broader currents of Cold War thinking. Because I think you absolutely can point to ex-communists for whom this was a stopping point on the way to a more full-throated right-wing faith. But I think actually this book and the authors of it speak to a kind of earlier moment of a anti-communism that was more sincerely left liberal and didn't immediately move into a kind of crusading right-wing politics.
So that's going to be the story next time. Next time in Political Conversions, we're going to be bringing the story closer to the present by talking about a group of people from the 1940s through to the 21st century, from the United States to Britain, who started their political journeys as Trotskyists and ended as something very different. For many of them, they ended up as neoconservatives. How did that journey happen? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.